thank you very much for inviting me to this great event. I'm hoping that this really is the vanguard of a movement in the United States to improve our schools. Since they had promised me that they wouldn't give out the scholarships till after I'd talked so that you would stay here, I'll talk quickly, and I know we're a bit late. I'm going to try to talk about, hopefully, 4 key questions. The first one is, does achievement matter? Which seems kind of silly at the end of this day that I say, does achievement matter? But my message here is to convince you that you all have underestimated the importance of achievement. Secondly, I want to talk about whether the US is competitive. Thirdly, I'll get down to Utah and how is Utah doing in my opinion. And fourthly, are there things to be done? Now, I really hate people who give talks like mystery novels. So just to be clear, here's the answers. Yes, no, not well, and yes. So if you'll remember that, and I'll fill in the answers to these questions. Now, I'm going to start out because I live in Stanford, California, which is one suburb or one city over from Mountain View, California. You all recognize Mountain View. It's the home of Google. And so I'm going to start out with essentially the Google Earth view of education, and then try to bring that craft down closer to Salt Lake City as we go. Now, it's interesting that people spend a lot of the time this morning trying to convince people that we ought to do something. We've been doing this for a long time in the US. We have commitment to growth that started, we usually date it at the Nation at Risk, which 3 decades ago said that if a foreign power had given us our schools, we would have declared it an act of war. This is followed up by President H.W. Bush, who called all the governors to Charlottesville, Virginia, and in 1989, and at the end of this, they made a pledge that the US would be first in the world in math and science by the year 2000. President Clinton picked up on that. He developed Goals 2000, which was how we're going to get there, what are the important elements of it. Skip ahead a little bit past 2000 now to in 2001, President George W. Bush said, everybody is going to be proficient by 2013. We're 2014, right? President Obama said, we have to outcompete the world or else we're going to be in trouble in his State of the Union speech. The one that hit home to me was actually my colleague down the hall, Condi Rice, who has an office down the hall from me, and she and Joel Klein, the former chancellor of New York City Schools, issued a report for the Council on Foreign Relations that basically said our future security depends upon improving our schools. You know, and you might think that that's hyperbole, but I'm trying to convince you that it's not, that it really is the message. Now, economists have thought a lot about growth, economic growth, and I have a simple picture here, which probably you can't see in the back of the room. But what is on the horizontal axis is conditional, I'll explain that in a second, test scores. Think of PISA scores that have been talked about today, or the other international test of math and science. And on the vertical axis is economic growth rate, the growth in GDP per capita over a 40-year period, long-run growth. So this is 1960 to 2000. And what you see here are all those little dots for you in the back, or if you're up closer, you'll see that they represent individual countries. And this is how countries array. From in the bottom corner is South Africa and Peru, and at the top is Singapore and Taiwan and Korea. There are a couple things that you should know about this line. Oh, I have to tell you what conditional means first. This is a statistical analysis of which the only other factor considered is what is the initial income level of the country in 1960. Now, why is that important? Well, if you start way behind, what do you have to do to grow? You just have to copy what everybody else does. And if you start ahead, you have to actually innovate. And that's why growth is slower in general if you start ahead and faster if you're China or other countries that have been working to develop. There are two things that might not have been apparent from that graph, if we can put that graph back up. First is all the countries are very close to this straight line. This is the fact that almost all of the variation in growth rates around the world are explained by the skills of the people. The second thing that you can't tell from this graph is that that's a very steep line, that it makes a huge difference. Let me back up a second and talk about some of the things that have been talked about today. We can also do the same kind of picture with years of schooling, the school attainment. This is whether people graduate, finish secondary school, whether they go to college and so forth. And what you see is that, yes, there's another straight line. First, the countries are a little bit more scattered around that straight line when I array the countries of the world. But more importantly, once I take into account the achievement and the knowledge of people, we get down to the bottom right-hand corner where it's a flat line. Now, it took me a long time to understand what this meant. What it means is if you go to school and you don't learn anything, it doesn't count. And that's all it means. And so it says that the basis for people graduating from high school and going to college is having the skills and a high skill level. And people who go to college with a low skill level are not going to succeed as we expect on average. And so that's why I always point to the level of knowledge that is developed in our primary and secondary schools. Now, let me go back to the governor's meeting in 1989. Here is PISA, which is the Program for International Student Assessment. It's taking a math test, translating it into individual languages and marching it around the world. And you can compare countries on how well they know math. What you see in the middle, you can't see these lines, but it starts out with Kyrgyzstan, Panama, Peru, and gets up to Shanghai and Singapore and Hong Kong at the other end. And that colored line in the middle is the United States. First in the world in math and science in 2000. This is 2009. There's a similar picture for 2012, by the way. It hasn't changed. Now let me show you how steep that curve was about economics and performance. Had we achieved being first in the world in 2000, as the governors had set as our goal in 1989, the previous line, history suggests that we would have grown faster. The green line here is how much higher GDP would be. The vertical axis is percentage gains in gross domestic product, and the horizontal axis is years. And over time, had we been first in 2000, our economy, according to historical lessons, would have grown faster. How much faster? Well, let me add some balance to that. The red line here is how much of our GDP is spent on education each year? What percentage? Now, if you look at where the green line crosses the red line, it says, had we been first in the world in 2000, education would have been free today. The added growth would have completely paid for our entire school bill, according to history. Now, history may be wrong, but we've got 40 years of growth around the world. Now, being first in the world in 10 years is pretty ambitious, so you might say, well, what if we stretched it out to 20 years? Well, that means that it would be 2019 before education would be free in the United States, according to the economic impact. So that's the argument, partially, that you underestimated growth. Let me give you a little bit more. I gave you this picture before of lining up countries according to their math performance internationally. I've singled out 3 countries there. The first one closest to the United States, closest to the center, is Germany. They look kind of like us in many ways. The second one is actually more interesting because that's Canada. And those of us in California think of Canada just like part of the US, except a little colder, okay? But they're significantly ahead of us. And the third one that I have down there is Finland, which has gotten a lot of attention because of its performance on these tests. Now let me show you very quickly what reaching any of those countries would mean for the US economy in the future. So I'm going to take that picture of how growth rates are related to achievement. I'm going to project out future GDP compared to what we get. We're going to grow without improving our schools. But what I'm trying to emphasize is that the difference between improving our schools and what we can expect as status quo is noticeable, considerable. So I'm going to project out future GDP. I'm going to add up all of the added income over the lifetime of somebody born today. Now, some of us aren't as concerned about what happens in 2090 as others. So I'm going to wait 2090 in the far distant times less. I'm going to discount back to the present. I'm going to calculate for the financial people in the room the present value of our future gains. And I'm going to see what it would mean to be each of those countries. So I'm going to do valuing these higher skills for Germany, Canada, and Finland. And then I'm going to also do No Child Left Behind. What would happen had we reached the goals that George W. Bush had set in 2001? So here it is, the economic value. The first one is being Germany. The present value of this is an incomprehensible number. It is $43.8 trillion. We currently have a $17 trillion economy. So we're talking about roughly 3 times our current GDP is the value into the future of just getting to be Germany. Now, another way of looking at that is if we project out GDP as we would expect without improving our schools, and then with improving our schools to Germany, on average, GDP would be 6% higher each and every year into the future. 6% is enough to eliminate all of the current fiscal problems, the concerns about Medicare, the concerns about Social Security. Or another way of looking at this is roughly 12% higher average paycheck for every worker in the United States over the next 80 years. Well, the numbers get out of sight. If I'll just flip through. Canada is $82 trillion, or a 20+ increase in average paychecks for every year of everybody in the US. Finland is $112 trillion. I mean, these numbers don't make any sense. But what is also important, and was brought up when we talked earlier today about some of the distributional issues, had we brought the bottom end up, or if we bring the bottom end of our population up to proficiency over the next 20 years, all these, by the way, are projections over the next 20 years, we would get almost the same as being in Canada, a little bit larger. That is the impact on the US. Now, Utah. Here's Utah and the nation. People have talked about this all day, and numbers slightly change. These are 8th grade math scores in 2011. They're the same in 2013, essentially. The US average is right in the center, as you might expect, and we have Utah snuggled up against the US average. Okay. Now, people talked about how there's such a good rate of return on schooling investment, and that's because Utah spends so much less than all the states in between. So per dollar spent, Utah is doing well. In terms of performance against another standard, it's not doing so well. Here is Utah against the world. Now, nobody can read this slide, of course. That's why you have to pay attention to me, okay? The blue lines here are nations who took PISA 2009 that we talked about before. And what I've done is just shuffle in where all of the states of the union are in red. And the US average is that green line going across the middle. And there's Utah, snuggled right next to the US average. And if you start reading countries, you see Poland, you see Hungary, you see Portugal, and a series of countries, Slovakia, countries that we normally would not want to be compared to as a nation. We don't view ourselves as being significantly behind Slovakia, but that's what the data say for Utah and for the nation. Now, many people say, well, it's just because Utah doesn't spend enough money. If we just spent more money in Utah, we could perform better. Here is the national picture of looking across states. All these little dots are states. The horizontal axis is the growth in expenditures between 1990 and 2009 in constant dollars. Vertical axis is the growth in achievement scores. And what you see is, first, a flat line across the states. The amounts spent or added to the spending in schools did not systematically lead to better performance. It did for some states, it didn't for other states. You have up in the top left-hand corner, you have Florida that essentially is spending the same in 2009 as they did in 1990 and has recorded some of the largest gains in performance over that time period of achievement gains. And for all of you who have been squinting to see where Utah is below average in terms of the increase in spending, but also below average in terms of the gains in performance. So the question is, what can be done? And we've got a lot of research now that shows quite clearly what can be done. The first one is improving teacher quality. Some of you may have heard that before. The second one is improving teacher quality. And you might have now inferred that the third one is also improving teacher quality. The research suggests that nothing matters other than the effectiveness of the teacher in front of the classroom. We can aid that and make that teacher more effective, but that's what the story is. Now, the big picture on teacher quality is the following. Good teachers are essential, but many people then turn around and say, but it's too hard to change what we're doing with teachers. We just have to ride with it. And the message here is that if that's the case, you're facing very different economic futures depending upon what path is chosen. And as discussed earlier in the morning, there's been an enormous amount of attention on tomorrow as opposed to the long-run future. And the 2008 recession pales compared to being close to Germany. If we got our achievement up to Germany over the next 20 years as a nation, the value of that is literally 10 times the total cost of the 2008 recession from 2008 till today. Let me talk a little bit about teacher quality quickly. I know I'm pushing your time here, and you've already got your scholarships. So let me try to quickly go through a couple things here. The research systematically shows that teachers are the most important thing. The big problem is that the characteristics and the things we use generally to measure teacher quality are, by the research we have, unrelated to effectiveness in the classroom. So whether a teacher has a master's degree or not, on average, does not indicate whether the teacher is more effective or not. Experience, except for, the asterisk means except for the first couple years, doesn't mean anything on average. So a fifth-year teacher on average is as effective as a 25th-year teacher. The amount of, let me go back. The amount of certification, whether teachers are fully certified or not, their point of preparation, whether they've gone to a traditional college or whether they've gone to BYU or whether they've gone to a community college or whatever, doesn't systematically make a difference. And unfortunately, in terms of generally implementing professional development, that has not shown to be very effective. So The Economist takes this and says, first, you just can't regulate good teaching. You have to provide to the economist better incentives. Now, to give you an idea of how much is there, this is a picture of, against years of experience, average salaries in the US. It's 2007. It doesn't make any difference that it's changed. The bottom line is the progression of salaries for somebody with a BA degree. The red line is the progression of salaries for somebody with a master's degree. What does that amount to? Well, over half of the teachers in the United States have a master's degree. That's 9.5% of the total wage bill for teachers. But it's unrelated to effectiveness in the classroom on average. 85% of our teachers have greater than 2 years of experience. That's 27% of the salary bill. But those differences in experience don't signify more effective teachers. There are some older teachers that are excellent, and there's some older teachers that aren't excellent. There are some younger teachers that are excellent, and some that are not. It's not a statement against the average teacher. It's a statement that experience by itself doesn't lead to better effectiveness. So let me quickly go through approaches. The first thing in The Economist book is to align pay and performance. We want to have an evaluation system that identifies who is doing well and who is not. We want to reward success. I think that we woefully underpay our better teachers. In fact, we woefully underpay the average teacher in the US. And Utah is a low-pay state compared to the national average. I think it's horrible, except for one thing. There's also a small group of teachers that we overpay noticeably, that aren't doing the job. And so I think that we also, at the same time of paying more for teachers, also have to consider what I would call the zero option, and that is some people should be doing other jobs and get a zero paycheck as opposed to the ones that they're getting. Now, the evidence that we have suggests that that's really a big deal. So this is a simple graph that says we now know a lot about how different teachers are in terms of their effectiveness in the classroom. And so what this says, this is an experiment that says, let's line up all of the teachers in the United States from Salt Lake City to wherever they go. The average teacher might get to Chicago if we lined up all 3.5 million teachers in terms of their effectiveness. I'm going to start at the end of the curve and just replace the bottom 1% with an average teacher, or the bottom 2% with an average teacher. And then, from what we know about the range of effectiveness, what would this mean for US performance? So this is a graph which I call a low estimate of effectiveness. There's actually a range of how different teachers are. But if we trace this out, you see that as we go to replacing 2% of the teachers with an average teacher, or 4% or 6%, at about 8% of the teachers, according to this estimate, you would be at Canada. Canada was $82 trillion, if you remember, or 20 plus increases in the average paycheck. Now, there's a range of estimates. There's other estimates that would give you even stronger effects from this. So according to the other plausible range of teacher estimates, you get the blue line, which if you got to replacing 5% of the teachers with an average teacher, you might get to Canada. So somewhere between 5 and 8%. Well, 5% or 8% school with 30 teachers is the bottom 2, or somewhere between 2 and 3 teachers, which I suspect that all of the parents in this room recognize that there were probably a couple teachers in the school that you didn't want your kids with. And that's what this is all about. By the way, you also get, according to the blue line, at about 8%, there's some chance that we got to Finland, which was $112 trillion. Well, I'll just run through some of the things that have been talked about. Research suggests that strong accountability systems that hold people responsible for their performance are helpful to achievement. What the governor talked about is that one size doesn't fit all, and that having local decision-making within a system of accountability gives you some considerable gains in terms of achievement. And having more parental choice over what schools kids go to is important. I left off of this list, or put it at the bottom, something that Utah is doing is improving preschool education. That's important. I left that off because I'm focusing more on the K-12 system. Well, finally, let me just say a word about the things that Rob Hutter talked about at the very opening of today, and that is technology and innovation. If you live in Silicon Valley, you see the things that Rob was talking about, these amazing different programs and applications to help learning. But you also see, as you go around the country, that we don't even know how to think about them. Are they complements to the teacher? Are they substitutes for the teacher? Do they replace teachers? We don't know how to think about those things yet, and so we don't see it taking over the schools, even though it looks like it should. Again, I think what we have to believe when we talk about technology, which is a component of all the things talked about today, is getting incentives for the teachers to select the right technology for them, the technology that works in their classroom. And we're just starting to think about that. Well, let me see if I can move to the... You remember these questions? Do you remember the answers? Does achievement matter? How is the US doing? How is Utah doing? And are there things to be done? Yes, no, not well, and yes. And I'll stop there. Thank you.